All right, class, now on to part two of the nervous system. We're going to start with components of the brain, and then we're going to move to the spinal cord. And then after talking about the central nervous system, we'll get into the divisions of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so this chart here is really great because it gives you the anatomical divisions of the nervous system. So what we're going to do first is start with the central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord. And then later, well, the rest of this picture is the peripheral, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so starting with the brain, there are more than 120 million neurons processing information and managing 100 different physiological functions like pain, perception, hunger, temperature, thirst, memory, movement, 24/7. The brain we know is protected by the skull, and the spinal cord is protected by the vertebrae. Both of those are bathed in the cerebral spinal fluid that protects the sensitive neural tissue. So what is the cerebrum? It's referred to as the seat of consciousness. It's responsible for integration of complex sensory and neural functions and factors. It initiates and coordinates voluntary movement, like contraction. The cerebrum divided into right and left hemispheres, and that's connected by this corpus callosum, which you see in this picture is this green region. The corpus callosum is a broad band of nerve fibers joining the two hemispheres of the brains. This communication trunk contains about 200 million nerve tissue, and it's covered by a thin shell of gray matter that extends across the entire surface of the cerebrum. Now let's talk about the four hemispheres, the four lobes. So we'll look at the cerebral cortex, and the cerebrum is just kind of all of this covering here, but each lobe is what we'll look at next. So first is the occipital lobe. We know occipital is our visual information. So it interprets information from the retina of the eyes, so our visual stimuli. It recognizes color, objects, faces, words, movement, depth, and hallucinations. Next is the temporal lobe. We usually refer to the temporal lobe as our auditory lobe, so auditory signals and language, but also memory. The temporal lobe controls memory via the hippocampus, which is associated with forming memories and storage, so short and long-term storage. It's smaller and it deteriorates faster in males, the hippocampus. And the temporal lobe also controls our hearing. So that's where the auditory signals come in. So different pitches, how far away a sound is. This is how we recognize different voices, identify special sounds. And this lobe also allows for the understanding of language and speech. Next is the parietal lobe. This lobe interprets information from the senses for sensory processing, like proprioception or spatial sense, which is the feel of shapes, and touch. So it's our general interpretive area. And then next is the motor, or last is the, not motor, frontal cortex. Frontal lobe contains the motor cortex, which involves the control of voluntary movements. It also controls speech, so this is where Broca's area is. It controls our personality. So this is where our decisions, emotions, cognitions, like thoughts, problem-solving skills, our social behaviors, our perception, imagination, and judgment all occur and makes up who we are. All right, this picture here is really neat because it shows all these different areas, and then it also goes into a little bit more detail about these areas here. So what I would normally do is we would talk about damage to these areas. So we talked about like what would happen with damage to the frontal lobe. If we want some, I guess, findings have shown aggressiveness, lack of emotion, lethargy, altered personality, lack of speech, inability to plan and coordinate movements. So that's been shown to occur with damage to the frontal lobe. You can see where the motor cortex is right here, and then where Broca's area is there. Parietal lobe, what would happen if we damaged this area? Inability to identify objects, also loss of proprioception, difficulty writing, solving simple math problems. You can see here our general interpretive area, so general senses. Next, occipital lobe. We know this is mainly our visual area. So degrees of blindness would occur, maybe hallucinations, inability to locate objects in space, poor depth perception, unable to calculate movement speed, being colorblind, can't identify words or faces. And then last is the auditory cortex, last is the temporal lobe, which contains the auditory cortex. So damage here would be degrees of hearing loss, difficulty learning new skills, or forming short and long-term memory. And then next, what we would kind of look at is cranial nerves. So we see all these cranial nerves here. This class, we do not have to memorize the cranial nerves, what they are. When I got my master's degree in exercise science, I did have to learn all of those, what they controlled, where they were located. But you don't have to do that. It's just a neat picture to look at and see where all of those cranial nerves are. Just so you know, cranial nerves do control first we can start with the face. So like eyelids, eye movement, pupil dilation. Some of them control the jaw muscles and facial sensations, tongue sensation and movement. Also hearing sounds, speech, swallowing, neck and shoulder movements. So just kind of everything from the neck up is what those cranial nerves control. So 2 videos here at the bottom that I'm not going to click on and watch because that will extend the time of this video, and you can do that on your own. They're really neat though. They just go over the lobes of the brain and they talk about just different regions of the brain and the cranial nerves. So next, what we would look at is a research study looking at different types of exercise and how it kind of affects the motor cortex. So I've kind of outlined each one of these. Normally what I would have y'all do is just look at the pictures, read kind of the exercises, and then come up with a conclusion. So think about it. What can you conclude from just looking at this picture? What do you think is happening? So let's kind of go over it. We have different types of exercises and they're all very different. The main purpose of this study was to understand how the central nervous system plays a role in exercise adaptation. These technological advances can provide new insights into the functions of the brain. So research supports that the motor cortex or motor cortical activity will increase with an increase in exercise intensity. So it's demonstrated that highly trained lifters have greater motor cortical activity as fatigue gets stronger. So even when loads are reduced to allow for completion of certain reps or exercises, the images of the brain show greater motor cortical activity with high intensity exercises that cause fatigue. So let's start at the bottom actually. So we look at here control exercise or control group, no exercise. We see nothing. The brain does not light up. So there's no activity in the motor cortex or in the brain at all. Now we have 6 sets, about 10 reps, 75% of the 1 RM. This is going to be kind of like a moderate like hypertrophy workout. So maybe like endurance hypertrophy style. It's so high volume basically. You see very little activity in the brain. A little bit, but not a lot. Now here we have a really high intensity workout, so high force. So the load is really heavy, but the volume is really low. and look how active the brain is. So we have increased motor cortical activity and then other regions as well. And then this is a power workout. So high power jump squats, we also see a lot of activity in the brain. So the conclusion was that high force and high power activities are going to have greater motor cortical activity in the brain, which may promote long-term adaptations. All right, so let's continue with other structures of the brain, first being the cerebellum. So cerebellum regulates muscle coordination. Cerebellum is, I can go back, this guy right here at the bottom. So it's referred to as the little brain. So the little brain, it governs some unconscious and autonomic functions such as balance and voluntary movement. It allows for the execution of motor movements, also normal posture during regular activities and sports. Damage to the cerebellum can result in the inability to walk, to reach for objects, and to coordinate fine motor skills. Next is the diencephalon. This contains the hypothalamus. So what is the hypothalamus? It lies just below the thalamus, and it relays information about bodily sensations to the motor cortex. This is where nervous and hormonal system interactions take place. It's called the homeostatic center. So the hypothalamus, what does it regulate? It regulates thirst, temperature, water balance, and hormone function. Next is the brainstem. So this is where the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain are. So modulates cerebral function. What does it regulate? It regulates breathing, so heart rate, blood pressure, reflexes like sneezing, coughing, vomiting, swallowing, and then also levels of wakefulness, so consciousness and sleep. And then last structure is the limbic system, and this encircles the top of the brainstem. This governs subconscious instincts and emotions. This helps to link higher brain centers like thinking and remembering to lower structures that coordinate autonomic bodily functions. If you're interested, you can watch this 2-minute neuroscience here at the bottom. It goes over the brainstem. But let's move on to the spinal cord. So spinal cord, we know, is still part of the CNS. It branches off of the brainstem. So it's just a bundle of nerves, and we know it's enclosed and protected by the vertebrae, and it's bathed in the cerebral spinal fluid to keep it protected. So it branches into the spinal nerves that target organs, and then information passed from higher brain centers to the periphery. So all of those nerves that activate the different nerves and muscles of our body, that's where information can be sent from the brain to our periphery, so everything outside of the CNS. So it controls both sensory operations and motor operations. So let's kind of give an example of this. So this is basically, there are two branches. So every branch of the nerves, there's two parts of it. There's a sensory part and there's a motor part. So it's a local circuit from the spinal cord. They level out to the periphery and then they level back, providing operations for sensory and motor function. So an example of like sensory would be like a reflex to like heat. So something hot or something cold, or something painful. So that would be a sensory information. And so that sensory operation would be on one of these, and it would go and it would be processed, and then the motor part would come back off of and branch off of that same nerve. And that's where we would take our hand off the heat, where we would take our hand or whatever, our body from whatever is painful. The motor part, the motor activities also help with local repetitive movements. So think about information just being sent back and forth from the spinal nerve. This helps to perform like running at a set pace. So if I want to run like an 8-minute mile and I want to run it for 6 miles, that's a repetitive action. I have to do that, all those movements over and over again. And so that's what this spinal processing helps with. So let's look at different parts of the spinal cord and the nerves. So A is this picture here. It shows nerves innervating muscles at different areas. If you look closely, it's pretty interesting. We know that we have 7 cervical vertebrae, and we have 8 cervical nerves. We have 12 thoracic vertebrae, which are here in the middle, and then also 12 thoracic nerves, and then 5 lumbar vertebrae, 5 lumbar nerves, and then 5 sacral vertebrae and 5 sacral nerves, and then our coccygeal bone down here at the bottom. If you kind of look through this, you see that our cervical vertebrae, or cervical nerves, innervate a lot of our upper body, like our neck, our wrists, triceps, fingers. You see thoracic, kind of our abdominal muscles. You see lumbar is going to be like hamstrings, quads, knees, our feet, and then so on and so on, kind of our bowels, our bladder down here in the sacral region. So really neat just to see where those nerves are actually innervating, that they do come from a region in our spinal cord, and that's where they level out to. So it's very localized. And then next over here is B. You see kind of the anatomical divisions of the spinal cord, looking at the different ascending and descending tracts, the lateral horns, dorsal horns, ventral horns. That's not something that we'll go into, so I won't even go into explaining any of that. All you kind of have to know is the cervical, thoracic, lumbar vertebrae, and just that those nerves kind of branch off of them. But yeah. If you're interested, you can watch this YouTube video right here. It goes into all of these divisions of the spinal cord. But let's talk about what is the main purpose of the spinal cord, and what you need to keep in mind. It is all about reflex actions. So all of our reflexes are controlled at the spinal cord. So we know that our reflexes are needed during daily activities. So sleep, exercise, sports to adjust to environmental cues, just like everyday activities. We have 2 different divisions, which we already learned about. So afferent sensory, and then connects with the efferent motor. So the sensory will bring information from the periphery cells to the central nervous system. Sometimes there's an interneuron there to fine-tune that signal for the reflex to occur properly. And then the motor neuron will cause the response in the periphery, so in the muscles, due to instructions from the central nervous system. So why is the spinal cord important in sports? It basically allows us to respond to a stimulus without very much conscious sensory processing. So what's the benefit of this? Normally, I would have you talk with your neighbor for about 30 seconds and figure out what is the purpose or what's the importance of the spinal cord in sports. And after thinking about it, I'm sure a lot of you, some of you would say, number 1, it decreases the need to actually have to think about the movement. So it makes it become more automatic. And it decreases higher brain center involvement when you're highly trained, meaning that we don't have to send the information all the way up to the brain. We can process it locally, kind of at the spinal cord, which means the signal is going to travel faster. If we don't have to send it to the brain, it's processed at the spinal cord. This occurs in highly trained individuals. And again, more important, what's the benefit? Increased coordination and processing speed at a central level. So faster reaction times. Athletic skills we know require rapid responsiveness, hand-eye coordination, and very good reflexes. So this allows for the maintenance of movement patterns without errors when we become more trained. Continuous practice of neuromuscular movements may also train our reflexes for faster non-voluntary response to a sensory stimuli. So training results in decreased response time and increased motor pattern recruitment. So we have quicker reaction in response to a stimulus and increased fine motor skills. So you can see how important this is in so many sports. All right, next let's talk about looking at the myotatic reflex. So this is called the tendon jerk reflex. It's when your patellar tendon is struck with a direct mechanical tap. It's one of the simplest reflexes in the body, and it's monosynaptic, meaning that there's an interaction between sensory and motor neurons to contract the quadricep, but no need for an interneuron. The interneuron connection to modify the reflex in the spinal cord is used to relax the hamstring instead. So let's kind of look at this. Normally, I would also just put this up here and say, okay, what is the purpose of this reflex, and explain the relationship that we see here in this picture. So what do we see? So we have all had this done. So we have our knee tapped here, and it stretches or kind of taps that patellar tendon. And what does it do? It actually stretches the quadricep muscle. When it stretches the quadricep muscle, it stimulates muscle spindles. When it stimulates the muscle spindle, it's going to send a signal to the brain, or actually not to the brain, to the spinal cord, and don't look at the green part, just follow this blue guy. And then we have a motor neuron come back to the quadriceps, and it contracts the quad, because that's the role of a muscle spindle. When the spindle is stimulated, it's stimulated due to a stretch, and then it causes a contraction. So the quadricep contracts, and that allows the leg to kick out. So where's this interneuron involved? Right here. So we see, same thing, that the quad was stretched, that signal goes to the spinal cord, and then we do have an interneuron here that's used to relax the hamstring. So the hamstring is relaxed so the quadricep can contract. But yeah, so the tap slightly stretches the quad, muscle spindle causes the quad to contract, and the reflex is to kick out rapidly. So why is this used in clinical evaluations? It's basically a grading system to test your reflex response accurately, and it measures the ability to maintain posture and balance. The absence of or exaggerated reflex will suggest damage to the cerebellum. Pretty interesting. This video right here, I think it's a 2-minute neuroscience video, and it does go over this tap. It basically says everything I just said, but if you like those videos and if you want more information, then go ahead and watch that video. But let's move on to a similar concept that we just kind of talked about, how the quadricep contracts and the hamstring relaxed. We want to talk about what another kind of name for that. First, we know that training produces neural adaptations. So when you think of a neural adaptation, it's caused by changes to the central nervous system. And our reflexes can become augmented. Augmented meaning they can become greater, they can be increased or improved. So reciprocal innervation, what is this? It's basically what we just discussed on the last slide. So when we have an afferent sensory nerve fiber synapse with the initiator neuron to activate and contract the agonist, just like when we do a leg extension, the target muscle is the quadricep. We're doing a knee extension, we're kicking out our feet, the quad is contracting. That's the agonist muscle. We want to activate it. But in order to do that, we actually have to prevent the contraction of the opposing muscle or the antagonist, which is the hamstring. So there's going to be, the neuron is going to synapse with the inhibitor interneuron to prevent the contraction of the opposing muscle. In this case, it's the hamstring. And that's exactly what we saw on the last slide. It's just called reciprocal innervation. And there's a picture right here of reciprocal innervation where, in this example, we're doing a deadlift, but same thing where our knees are extending. So knee extension here. And this just explains it again. It shows it one more time with our afferent versus efferent fibers and looking at the inhibition and then activation of the target and the antagonist muscle. All right, so we made it to the peripheral nervous system. So before I move on, one thing to keep in mind is we're going to have a lot of splits that take place. So you do kind of have to keep that in mind. We're about to go through all these different splits, but it's kind of broken out for you pretty easily. Okay, so peripheral nervous system exists outside of the brain and spinal cord, and it serves as communication to where we can relay what's going on back and forth between brain and spinal cord and the rest of the body. It's also made up of nerves and ganglia, which is just a group of nerve cell bodies that interact with muscles, organs, glands, all in the peripheral nervous system. And then it connects the central nervous system to the environment, so to all of that environmental stimuli, to gather sensory input on situations and then initiate the appropriate motor output. One thing to keep in mind is the peripheral nervous system is not surrounded by the blood-brain barrier like the central nervous system is, leaving it more exposed to chemicals, toxins, and mechanical injury. So first, let's talk about the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so it's regulated by the brainstem and the hypothalamus. So autonomic, brainstem, hypothalamus have control over this. It acts as an integrator for autonomic function, receiving regulatory input from the autonomic nervous system. So let's talk about the word autonomic. What does autonomic actually mean? It means involuntary or unconscious. Auto meaning self, and then nomic meaning law. So it's basically a self-governing system. What does it control here? So think about everything that's unconscious. Heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, digestion, and reflexes. We have no control over a lot of this. Breathing is one thing that we can control, but eventually the autonomic system will override our breathing. If we try to like hold our breath, it will take control or take over. Reflexes, we can cause reflexes to occur sometimes, but reflexes, again, occur on their own. So the autonomic nervous system is separated into parasympathetic and sympathetic. And I know you are familiar with these systems here. So keep in mind, autonomic, parasympathetic, and sympathetic. Okay, so let's start with sympathetic. We know that this system is activated anytime we are under stress or a situation related to our survival. There's a structure in the brain associated with this system, and it's called the amygdala. The amygdala is associated with the fight, flight, or freeze, which is our natural response to stress or danger. This system plays a role in memory processing, decision making, our emotions, and it sends those stress signals to activate sympathetic nervous system. What hormone is activated or secreted is epinephrine. Epinephrine is also called adrenaline. So adrenaline is secreted, that's epinephrine, which is triggered by danger, thrills, excitement, stress. So epinephrine is a hormone derived from amino acids. It causes that adrenaline rush that we feel, and it's only released in the body during times of heightened emotion. It prepares the body for immediate danger, exercise, and challenges to the body. It also allows athletes to perform and tolerate intense physical stress, like exercise. But what about norepinephrine, also called noradrenaline? Noradrenaline is released in small amounts and at a low level throughout the day and the night. So very steady, small amounts throughout a 24-hour period, where epinephrine is only secreted in those times that I just kind of mentioned. Norepinephrine helps to increase alertness. It promotes vigilance. It enhances retrieval of memory, and it increases focus, all of which we need on a day-to-day basis at all times. So when stimulated, what's going to happen? So when this system is active, we're going to have an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, and blood flow. We're going to have a release of glucose from the liver, breakdown of muscle glycogen. This is basically to give us fuel. So giving us fuel for whatever we're about to do, whether that's exercise or run away from danger, just facilitates the ability to continue to produce voluntary contractions if necessary. But we are going to watch a video here because I really like this one.
Like all species, have self-protective mechanisms to help us survive. Our fight, flight or freeze survival response, the FFF for short, is designed to mobilize our brain and body to fight an enemy, run from an avalanche, or freeze to hide from a predator. Our brain sometimes misinterprets safe situations as dangerous and can set off false alarms. When the amygdala, our brain's watchdog, senses and barks danger, our body enters survival mode quicker than our rational mind can react, leaving it trying to figure out why we feel in mortal danger. When the FFF alarm is sounded, we start to breathe more quickly and shallow, causing hyperventilation, and our heart starts beating very fast. These changes can cause strong chest pain, which many people interpret as symptoms of a heart attack, when in fact it's just a result of the FFF activation, which can be relieved through breathing exercises. As a way of getting you ready for action, blood is diverted towards the major muscle groups. Blood flows away from our digestive system, causing the bladder to relax, and we might feel the need to pee. The mouth goes dry, nausea can occur, and we get the butterflies feeling in our stomach. Blood also rushes from extremities, leaving us with cold hands, but often sweaty palms as the action-ready body starts sweating to avoid overheating. Legs and hands can start trembling and feel weak, while tension starts building in big muscles like the thighs, neck, and shoulders. In our head, FFF alarms cause our brain to focus on negative memories, probably so it can scan them to avoid danger and negative outcomes. We get tunnel vision as our pupils dilate to increase our focus and long vision, but as a result we lose our peripheral vision. FFF activation also reduces our ability to recognize differences in facial expressions. Too much oxygen and too little CO2 can result in dizziness or lightheadedness, which many people interpret as signs that they might faint. But because fainting is caused by a drastic drop in blood pressure, and because the FFF increases both our heart rate and blood pressure, it's nearly impossible to faint when this happens. Over time, depression, anxiety, and high levels of stress all harm the brain's ability to slow or cancel false FFF activations, causing them to happen more often. Knowing the symptoms of false activations makes it easier to recognize and reduce their effects. At Tankyboxen, you can learn both bottom-up and top-down techniques to reduce false FFF activation.
So yeah, pretty interesting about that. Moving on to parasympathetic nervous system. So we also should be familiar with this system. So this is what brings us back to homeostasis after a sympathetic event. So this is referred to as rest and digest, or feed and breed. This system is going to help to slow bodily functions and restore the body to a state of calm. What chemical is released? Acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is used to regulate homeostasis. It's our neurotransmitter, the chemical involved in the system. When stimulated, what happens? So we're going to have a decrease in blood pressure and heart rate, and then a decrease in body temperature. We're going to have a constriction of pupils, increased blood flow back to the skin rather than to the muscles. We're going to have paralysis of our GI tract, bladder, saliva, which is just the involuntary constriction of and the relaxation of muscles or canals. When is this system, or I guess what activities would cause stimulation of parasympathetic? After eating, so for digestion, we feel a sense of calm, relax, parasympathetic kicks in. After lacrimation is just crying. We usually feel really calm after a really hard cry. It's because parasympathetic is coming back in to calm the system. After stress, anxiety, fear, we have this system activated, return to a rested state. And then after exercise, to help restore our body's vitals. One thing to note, you need to know this, parasympathetic system is essential for recovery from exercise. It allows for sweating post-exercise. It helps to decrease heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate. It helps to heal muscle tissue, and then restoration of our vital functions. We can also train our parasympathetic system to work better and to work faster by returning us to baseline quicker. If you think back to lecture 3 or chapter 3, we talked about EPOC. So excess oxygen consumption post-exercise. We can train that system to work faster, and that's just called increased parasympathetic tone, and we'll talk more about that in chapter 6. But let's look at other divisions. We already talked about the autonomic nervous system, and now we're going to talk about the sensory somatic system. But we're kind of familiar with this already. This is associated with voluntary control of movements. We just kind of finished talking about the involuntary kind of results of our body, and now we're going to get into the voluntary activation. But again, we should already be familiar with this because if you look at this picture here, it's talking about sending action potentials to activate muscle tissue. So we already talked about this in part 1, but let's kind of go over it again. So what does somatic mean? Somatic is relating to the body, distinct from the mind. So it has nothing to do with the mind, relating to the body only. And then sensory, we know, is just our senses. So this system helps to coordinate actions and responses to our external environment. So we have our sensory, our afferent division, receives signals from the periphery. This relays information about sensations from the body to the central nervous system. Again, we already talked about this with synaptic transmission. Next is the motor, or the efferent. This is responsible for sending out commands from the central nervous system to the body, which allows for muscle contraction. What chemical is used here? This ACH, that's acetylcholine. If you think back to communication across the synapse, what was contained in those vesicles? It was a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is the chemical used in this system. So just to kind of, kind of sum up everything, just remember the periphery refers to your tendons, your muscles, your eyes, your ears, your skin, everything that receives signals or information about the external environment. Pressure, pain, temperature, sound, sight, that's all external stimuli. that's going to help connect, and we may use an interneuron to connect with the central nervous system. And then for motor, the action is carried out with a motor neuron. So via those pathways that go from the brainstem to the spinal cord that we looked at earlier, down to the lower motor neurons that coordinate movement and muscle contraction. All right, so that's the end of part 2. This here you don't have in your slides, but I've kind of divided up everything for you just so you can keep it all separate. So I tell you about the CNS, the PNS, and then what's the division there. And then we see sympathetic, parasympathetic, and then sensory somatic at the bottom. So yeah, that's it for part 2. The next video will be part 3.